How do you handle people who intend to hurt you? What is the proper course of action when someone causes you harm? Do you strike back, or do you turn the other cheek? Do you wait for the first blow, or do you anticipate it and neutralize the threat before it can unfold? If you do strike back, where do you stop? Is justice a matter of balance, like a tooth for a tooth? Or is it something harsher, something meant to teach a lesson so severe it will never need to be repeated? Questions about self-defense, preemptive violence, and even vengeance are concepts that every moral and legal system in the world has had to deal with. One man who has had to relate to this concept beyond it being a mere exercise in moral or legal philosophy is Christian Espedal, better known by his stage name Gaahl. He is a Norwegian vocalist, born in 1975 and raised in the remote region of Sunnfjord in western Norway, an area marked by dramatic landscapes, isolation and long distances between people. He's best known as the former frontman of the influential black metal band Gorgoroth, and his stage presence and personality has made him one of the genre's most iconic and controversial figures. Beyond Gorgoroth, Gaahl has been involved in several other musical projects, including Gaal's Weird, Trelldom and Godseed, and has collaborated with Vardruna. Outside of music, he works as a visual artist, focusing on drawing and symbolic design, and has pursued ventures in winemaking. He's also famous for being openly homosexual in the black metal scene. But now let's go back in time to the year of 2002. On a Friday night in February, Gaahl is out drinking beer with his friends at a pub in the small town of Fjaler. There he is approached by a man, Ole. Ole is new in town and doesn't really know anyone there. But he is an acquaintance of Gaal's father and brother, and therefore chooses to stick around. As the clock approaches 2 at night and the staff encourages the guests to go home, Gaahl does what any sensible man would. He decides that it's time to continue drinking and invites his friends to an after party in his home in the valley of Espedal, a 20-minute drive by car. At this point, someone in the group encourages Ole to come along, a proposal he is eager to accept. So, taxis shuttle people from the pub to Gaal's home, while Ole, who is several beers in, decides to drive his own car to get there. When he arrives, the taxis are gone and the party is already underway inside the small house where Gaahl lives. Gaahl offers Ole some wine and they sit down talking in good spirits. As time passes, Gaal's brother leaves the party to fetch some snacks from their parents' house nearby, and then diverts to start a fire in his own house where the party is supposed to continue. Up until this point, the people present are largely in agreement about what happened. But at that point, something changed. And what happened next would become the central question during the subsequent trial at the local district court. There, Ole and Gaahl would tell fundamentally different stories. Before the court, Ole describes how the atmosphere suddenly turned hostile, though he cannot explain why. He remembers that both he and Gaahl stood up, that he felt threatened and grabbed Gaal's jacket. At that point, everybody else left the house. But as they stood face to face, he suddenly felt a violent blow to the back of his head. The pain was so overwhelming that it paralyzed him, and everything felt unreal. Unable to defend himself, he was hit, kicked, and headbutted repeatedly. After he had collapsed on the floor, he was dragged into a chair where the beating continued. Gaahl punched him right on the nose, breaking it. As blood poured forth from his nose, Gaahl presented a cup for him to bleed in, exclaimed that he wasn't bleeding enough, and then punched him once more in the face. Gaahl then told him that he was going to drink his blood. He tried to escape several times, but was forced to remain in the chair. He remembers it as if someone else might also have been in the room with them, but is certain that Gaahl was the primary attacker. And while unsure of how long the assault lasted, he remembers that it felt like it would never end. Gaahl, on the other hand, tells a very different story. According to him, the argument began without any clear reason, sparked by a discussion about Ole being 10 years older than him. Suddenly, Ole attacked him without warning, punching him several times in the face. He stepped backwards until he hit the wall, and that's when Ole grabbed his hair and smashed his head into the wall with such force that he fell onto a sofa. After that, everything went black, and his next memory is Ole sitting in a chair in front of him, bleeding. He denies having continued any violence after this point, and also that he should have forced Ole to remain in the chair or even in the house. The cup, he says, he fetched so that Ole could bleed into it, as he would not have had any way to wash himself due to the fact of the house not having any running water. He offered Ole to stay the night, simply so that he should not have to drive home in the condition he was in. One witness, Sven, is heard by the court. He states that Ole attacked Gaahl first, by punching him in the face several times and smashing his head into the wall with such force that a painting fell down. As this happened, he rushed some girls out of the house as he feared that others could be hurt during the fight in the small space. He stayed outside with the girls, but they could all hear noises coming from inside. Eventually, Gaahl stepped outside and called him back in. As he entered the room, the fight was over. But Gaahl slapped Ole 2 or 3 times in the face, demanding an explanation as to why he had attacked him. Regarding the cup, Sven says that it was Ole himself who grabbed it so that he would not bleed onto the floor. So, what was the verdict of the court? In its judgment, the court begins by reaffirming a foundational principle of criminal law. A judgment may only be based on proven facts, and when reasonable doubt exists, the court must assume circumstances favorable to the defendant. And then it stated the following. The background of the confrontation cannot be conclusively established, nor can the precise sequence of events during the fight and its aftermath. Sven's credibility is limited. His statements in court contradict his earlier police interviews, and he was himself a suspect at one point. Also, it is evident that it would be problematic for him to give a statement that portrays Gaahl in unfavorable light. Ole's memories of what happened in the cabin that night have been fragmented and vague. Yes, this may be a result of physical and psychological trauma. The trauma may prevent him from remembering things in the correct order. The memories that are intact in his mind vary in both detail and intensity. The psychiatrist treating him has explained how people typically react to traumas and the memory loss that might follow. The court nevertheless concludes that there is evidence to prove that the parts that Ole actually do remember did happen. The court cannot discard the fact that Ole did hit Gaahl first, and that he may even have done so several times. But at the same time, the court can't find that Ole at any point would have had the upper hand during the fight. The court does not believe that Ole used as much violence as Sven has claimed. If that really was the case, then Sven would surely have rushed to Gaahl's side to aid him, as Ole was a stranger to the group. Furthermore, Gaahl has not displayed any injuries that would be consistent with the amount of violence that he and Sven claim that he was subjected to. In fact, his only visible injuries were a bruise on his forehead and a small wound on the inside of his lower lip. Still, due to the rules about the placement of burden of evidence in criminal cases, the court must base its judgment on the fact that Gaahl was initially subjected to an unlawful attack from Ole, and that he was justified in defending himself against it. But the violence that Gaahl responded with went far beyond what can be justified as self-defense against the initial attack. The court considers the degree of damage that was inflicted on Ole. He received a cut on his temple, on the back of his head, as well as damaged teeth. In addition to this, Ole has displayed a lot of bruises and marks on his face, showing that he had received a multitude of blows to his face. The court finds it proven that the violence continued for some time, even after Sven came back into the cabin. It is also proven that Gaahl forced Ole to remain in the chair, while he subjected him to even more violence. The court believes Sven when he says that Gaahl slapped Ole 3 times, but the court also finds it proven that there was additional and more severe violence on top of this. The same is true about the fact that Ole received a wooden cup that he was instructed to bleed in, and that he received a hard blow to his nose so that it broke. When Gaahl didn't think that Ole was bleeding enough, Ole was punched once again in the nose. Gaahl wanted Ole to explain why he had attacked him. On this point, the court considers what Sven said during the earlier police interviews, where it is noted that Gaahl even controlled and decided every movement that Ole was permitted to do or not. As the court perceives the situation, Gaahl seems to have conducted an interrogation with Ole and also handed out what he decided was the appropriate punishment. So Ole has been subjected to a terrifying experience that made him fear for his life. After having been shamed, he was placed in a chair where the violence continued, together with verbal assaults. Gaahl told Ole how he was going to drink his blood. Even though the court does not believe that he really intended to do that, it is evident that the statement was made to induce fear in Ole. Regarding the time frame, the confrontation must have begun around 4 o'clock, and while it is not of absolute relevance, the beating seems to have been going on for around 15 minutes. Another witness, Emil, has explained that he and Gaahl's brother went back into the cabin around 10 minutes after the fight had begun. At that point, Ole was sitting in the chair, bleeding, but Emil did not observe such a large amount of injuries on his face as documented in the photographs presented before the court. Even if one considers that the bruises and the swelling around the eyes must have needed some time to develop after the damage was inflicted, this still indicates that Ole was subjected to additional violence also after the point when Emil had entered the cabin. Another witness, Axel, has explained that he met Ole in bad shape in the town of Dale sometime between 4:30 and 5 in the morning. The photographs from the cabin reveal that there was a lot of blood around the chair that Ole had been sitting in. There were also bloodstains on the wall behind the chair, all the way up to the ceiling. Ole came under medical care from doctors after he had come to the town of Dale. He was then transferred to Förde Central Hospital, where he was admitted from Saturday to the following Thursday. At the hospital, he was treated for several cuts that needed to be stitched. His nose had a complex fracture, which he still suffers from today, although the current prognosis is that he will recover eventually. Some of the damage to his teeth will require treatment in the future to fully heal. Though no permanent brain damage has been found, Ole has suffered long-term psychological injury. He was terribly afraid and anxious when admitted to the hospital, and was shortly thereafter provided with psychiatric care. And he later developed depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder, resulting in years of reduced quality of life, as well as prolonged sick leave. The psychiatrist treating him has explained that the prognosis is looking favorable and that Ole is expected to be able to return to work sometime by the end of the year. The court has considered whether the injuries to Ole warrant the crime to be classified as a more severe form of assault. For that to be the case, the violence need to have led to significant injuries to body or health. Apart from the damage to Ole's teeth that will have to be treated again within a few years, Ole has not sustained any lasting injuries. The injuries that come closest in that regard are those to his mental health. And while not enough for the crime to reach the severity needed, the court finds that this will be taken into consideration when handing out the appropriate punishment. And when deciding on the length of the punishment, the court considers how Ole was stuck in a chair while the violence was carried out against him for an extended amount of time. He feared for his life and felt that even though there were other people around, nobody would come to his rescue to aid him, and that reinforced his sense of complete helplessness and made him even more terrified. These are brutal circumstances that need to be taken into consideration when deciding on the proper punishment. Gaahl is a 29-year-old man who has previous convictions for assault, and he is now to be convicted yet again for such a crime. The prosecutor has motioned for a prison sentence of 1 year and 6 months. When measuring out the punishment, the court considers the severity of the deed, but also that Gaahl initially was in a position of self-defense. This, however, is of minor relevance in the end, as Gaahl continued to commit raw, massive and protracted violence against Ole long after he had successfully defended himself against the initial attack. The crime, together with the fact that Gaahl is a repeat violent offender, warrants a stern reaction. But there has also been undue delay between the crime itself and the judgment, and that has been by no fault of Gaahl, which should therefore be taken into account as a mitigating factor. The court finds that the appropriate punishment is a prison sentence of 1 year and 6 months, with time reduced for having been detained during the investigation. In addition to this, the court orders Gaahl to pay economic compensation to Ole with roughly 100,000 Norwegian crowns. The judgment was unanimous and delivered on the 4th of May in 2004. Gaahl appealed the entire judgment, and while the Court of Appeal upheld the criminal conviction, it reduced the prison sentence to 1 year and 2 months, citing unreasonable delay not attributable to Gaahl, and that it should result in a larger reduction of the prison sentence than the district court had decided on. Regarding damages Gaahl should pay to Ole, compensation for violation of his integrity was lowered, but compensation for future losses due to inability to work were substantially increased. This was due to the fact that the initial prognosis of when Ole would be able to return to work had turned out to be far too optimistic. And that concludes this case against Gaahl. Now, this whole thing naturally attracted a lot of attention from the Norwegian media, who eagerly covered the entire trial with headlines about Satanism, ritual sacrifice, and black metal imagery. Among other things, it was described how Gaahl showed up to court in Gorgoroth merchandise and how Ole cried in court when recounting how Gaahl shouted that he would sacrifice and drink his blood. The coverage around Gaahl focused on the controversial nature of the band Gorgoroth and his role as its vocalist. At the time, its members were investigated for crimes of animal abuse and blasphemy in Poland after an infamous concert that featured a stage set up with naked women and men in mock crucifixions, as well as gallons of blood and sheep heads impaled on stakes. In May of 2005, as Gorgoroth was about to play a show in Bergen, the chairman of the Norwegian Society for Victims of Criminal Violence actually called for the concert to be cancelled or boycotted and argued that anyone participating would be complicit in the crimes of Gaahl and of the other members in the band. So no, Gaahl is not the only member with a criminal record. But let's return again to the question I posed initially, because one thing is irrefutable. Ole attacked Gaahl first, and Gaahl spent time in prison because of his reaction to this attack. Was his reaction justified? In a strictly legal sense, no. But what about morally? My personal opinion is that his response may have been an overreaction, but somehow the entire thing seems deeply unjust. Gaahl was unprovokedly attacked in his own home, a place meant to be safe, by a stranger that he had welcomed inside. From a moral standpoint, I find it troubling that the attacker became the victim in legal terms. In later interviews, Gaahl would state that being true to oneself matters more than obedience to the law, and that self-respect is a prerequisite in order to be able to respect other life. He rejects ideas of blind submission, which is one of the reasons why he finds the black and white worldview of Christianity so dangerous. Gaahl has also explained that the sheep heads at Gorgoroth concerts fit symbolically into his worldview. The dead sheep represent the ones who blindly follow the herd into death. And this is contrasted with the goat, the animal that walks its own path, free in mind. Furthermore, he has described his home in the mountainous region of Espedal near Sunnfjord as his sanctuary. That small house without television, internet or hot water, where the nearest store is an hour's walk away. And despite this, he did choose not to own a car, as he believes cars induce laziness. He's also a vegetarian and strong opponent of industrial livestock production. When speaking about he likes to spend his days, he has said that he prefers to be with nature, walking in the mountains and in the forests. And while he does like to enjoy wine, he is opposed to other means of intoxications such as narcotics. He's always preferred solitude to people and was never interested in sports or most social activities. When talking about his musical projects, he has described Gorgoroth as the expression of outward force, that which is acted out into the world, while his band Trelldom, which is still active by the way, represents more of the inward dialogue. His contempt for Christianity has only intensified with age, and he considers it both alien to Norwegian culture and harmful to people's minds. For that reason, he does not mourn the burning of churches, and black metal for him is a war against Christianity and the systems it represents. This he contrasts with Nordic paganism, which is described as a more complex and complete psychological and mythological system. And also one of the reasons why its texts are more cryptic and less accessible than those of the Bible. As for his personal taste in music, he has said that he actually listens very little to black metal at home, leaning more towards folk music, classical music, and that he is especially fond of David Bowie. When he was younger, he attended art school, and he still loves to paint and spends a lot of time doing that. He has also admitted that a great deal of melancholy lives in his visual work. Now, despite his prior violent convictions and the incident with Ole, Gaahl describes himself as a peaceful man. He maintains that every criminal offense occurred in a context where he was defending himself. And based on what I have seen, I do believe him. I think it makes sense. I do not know Gaahl, but he strikes me as both peaceful and intelligent. I see a quiet, reserved, and deeply introspective man. A creative person with a complex inner life and unusual emotional depth. Someone who seems far more at home in solitude and symbolic thought than in crowds and modern social structures. And this inevitably leads me to a broader question that I have been thinking about lately. You see, there is a certain personality type, and I will focus on the male iteration of it here, that is introspective, emotionally intense, and deeply symbolic in how it relates to existence. In other words, a man for whom life is not merely a thing to get through, but something that presses on with meaning and emotional force, where experience can carry a truly violent intensity. One could use the word sensitive here. And with that, I do not mean weak or fragile or incapable. Rather, I mean someone who perceives both the external and inner world in a more raw and unfiltered way. This may overlap with the somewhat trendy concept of the so-called highly sensitive person, or HSP for short. I don't know how solid the scientific backing for that label is, but I do know that I have found it a useful concept for understanding people, including myself. Whatever you want to call it, it is evident that Gaahl embodies unusual and valuable personal traits. One relevant concept that springs to mind in this context, that I believe is important to fully understand someone like him, is that of normal distribution. You see, imagine a bell-shaped curve representing a large population of people. And then take something like height or intelligence. Most people cluster somewhere around the average. They are neither very tall nor very short. Not exceptionally intelligent, but not stupid. And then the further you move to the edges, to the extremes, the fewer people you will find there. This principle holds true for most things in nature, actually. The average tends to be more common. And in humans, this concept doesn't apply only to physical traits or intelligence. It also applies to more complex elements like temperament, emotional intensity, and modes of perception. So also in that regard, most people fall somewhere in the middle. They are marked by a high degree of adaptability. They are socially attuned, able to tolerate noise, other humans, and authority without much friction. They form the bulk of society. And this bulk is often symbolized as the sheep. They trust authority, follow norms, and avoid questioning the structure that they are embedded in. Now, I do not think that the sheep are useless. On the contrary, they provide a necessary stability and cohesion in a group, and act as the hands and feet of a functioning society. Without them, things wouldn't function very well. The problem arises when they are corrupted or misled by leaders who steer them in the wrong direction. But let's return again to the normal distribution curve, because I did not bring this topic up to end on a discussion about sheep. You see, a healthy society, a group of people, do not consist only of the middle, of the average man. And as you approach the edges of the bell curve, where the numbers thin out, you will find people who are less adaptable, less average, less agreeable, and less able to blend in. People whose rare strengths can also be their vulnerabilities. As you move outward from the center, you begin to find things like warriors, scholars, and leaders. But as you move even further out, you may encounter something even more rare. A true outlier. The one who doesn't fully belong anywhere. The one who walks beside the group rather than inside it. Who perceives too much, feels too much, questions too deeply, and is too affected by the symbolic and emotional undercurrents of existence to ever be fully at ease in ordinary social life. Across cultures and across time, such people may have been found under various labels, be it the shaman, the druid, or the wizard. And it makes sense that this kind of person that we are talking about here would also have a necessary role to play, one where his unusual sensitivity and openness to inner experience is channeled into something that benefits the group, allowing his traits to be put to good use, in other words. And I do believe that being allowed to assume that role, to find one's place and necessary function in a group, to find out who you are in the group, is very fundamental to the well-being of such an individual. Because living with open pores, if we should call it that, being emotionally and spiritually open, is not safe for the individual in any way. It exposes you to intensity that most people are shielded and buffered against. It's not by accident that nature has designed it so that this personality type is extremely rare. If we imagine a hunter-gatherer group of, say, maybe 100 people, there might be one such individual at most, so maybe not even that. And any functioning group, any healthy group of people depends on a balance of traits, like a well-designed role-playing party, if role-playing games are your thing. Different classes, complementary strengths, people with different traits who can carry one another when someone else collapses. Modern mass society is not designed with this taken into account. The normal distribution of traits and personalities among people and the relative size and balance between such traits. That is something that is necessary in a healthy tribe, but our civilization does not take it into consideration and is built almost entirely about the average man as the ideal, that everybody should be adaptable, replaceable, and easy to work with. The system of modern society assumes a certain tolerance for noise and annoyances, and actually for a polluted environment. And I don't mean that in the strictly physical sense. And those who deviate too far from the center are expected to adapt, suppress, maybe medicate, or to break. And many of them do break. When Gaahl contrasts the sheep with the goat, the one who walks beside the herd, unruly and independent in mind, I cannot help but think of this dynamic about outliers in human society. And this is where black metal enters the picture, because there is a pattern here that becomes difficult to ignore. This particular personality type, the sensitive outlier, the symbolic thinker, appears overrepresented among black metal musicians, and probably among fans as well. The emotional depth is visible in the art, but also in how these people struggle. How many of them either end or ruin their own lives or that of others. Sometimes you will see claims that this is due to them being troubled souls, but that's not even a well-meaning simplification. It's a statement that is completely void of any understanding of what is actually going on here. People like Gaahl live at the edge of distribution, without a real role in society fitting their disposition. When I look at him, I don't just see an individual case. I see a pattern. Gaahl is not the conclusion. He's a case study. Because when society doesn't have a place for its shamans, it doesn't get rid of them. They don't go away. It just breaks them. And they are left to themselves to try to put together the pieces in a way that makes sense.